Welcome to From the Quarries. Tonight's video, The Builders of Babylon, is an extract from a lengthy lecture given by Right Excellent Companion B.G. Patterson to the research chapter number 100 of the Supreme Grand Royal Arch chapter of Queensland. Unfortunately, the copy I have is missing its first page and is consequently undated, but I do know that Companion Patterson was active in Queensland Royal Arch Freemasonry between the 1940s and the 1970s. I do hope you enjoy it.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's presentation, From the Quarries, an archive of Masonic lore.
If we are prepared to admit that Masonry is a very ancient institution, disagreeing with those who assert that there was nothing worth calling Masonry before 1717, we must also recognize that it has two head streams, one taking its rise in Egypt and the other in Babylon. And though the waters from these two streams mingled and flowed together through many centuries, in modern times there has been a separation, and what comes to us from Egypt is to be found largely in the first 3 degrees, whilst that has been derived from Babylonia seems to have made its way into our red degrees. There has not been a clear-cut division, it is true, but there has been a division sufficient to make Babylonia of peculiar importance to us. Before going further, however, it is necessary to touch upon one point. There are some who will say, "After all, what does it matter? For did not Babylonian civilization come from Egypt?" And these people can even quote authorities in support of their contention. But in recent times, new evidence has become available from year to year, and these authorities are now out of date. Dr. Maurice Jastrow, an authority of commanding eminence, says of Babylonia, "We have evidence, albeit not conclusive, that a high order of civilization first developed in that region. Its only possible rival is Egypt, and the indications at present are that while the actual beginnings of Egyptian civilization may be further back than the Euphratean culture, yet Babylonia takes precedence in the unfolding of an advanced form of cultural achievement." Dr. Jastrow wrote in 1915, and later explorations have derived ardent admirers of the land of the pharaohs of even the poor comfort they can derive from his guarded statement. For we read in Seton Lloyd's book, which made its appearance in 1947, that traces were found a few years ago of a pre-Sumerian culture almost 10,000 years old, whilst Egyptologists are apparently not prepared to carry the story of Egypt much further back than 6000 BC. Egypt and Babylonia were in contact with one another in far-off times, but culturally each developed independently of the other. In the early history of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, although there was continuity in the life and civilization of the land, rulers and ruling nations changed. But we are not concerned with these changes, and we can conveniently speak of a Babylonian civilization, implying thereby a culture which began in Sumerian or even pre-Sumerian times, which gave rise to that of Assyria, Persia, and Media, and which influenced surrounding nations and nations that came later into history. For the great importance of Babylonian civilization has been realized only within comparatively recent years. Consider then how largely this land and this civilization enter into red masonry. We include the Royal Ark Mariner's degree among those we work, and the deluge legend handed down by oral tradition from the most remote times until it was committed to writing by the scribes who were responsible for the Pentateuch, comes from the Euphrates Valley, where a number of versions of the story have been preserved in Babylonian literature, the oldest version having been impressed in cuneiform script on clay tablets more than 4,000 years ago. Furthermore, Sir Leonard Woolley and other archaeologists assert that it was in this valley that the flood actually occurred, for they have found artifacts of a primitive people overlain by a thick bed of alluvial silt, apparently deposited by a flood of unusual magnitude. And of the other degrees that we work, 3 are supposed to take place in the land of the captivity. 2 others are concerned with people who have just come from it, and another with captives who are on their way to it. It is clearly impossible to assert that Babylon does not concern us. But the historical background of these degrees is not of as great importance to us as are their symbolisms and teachings. And therefore we ask, did Babylonian lands make any appreciable contributions thereto? Directly, perhaps, they contributed little. Indirectly, they contributed much. For this ancient civilization undoubtedly influenced the descendants of the people who followed Moses and Joshua from Egypt into a land which had once been a Babylonian province, and which for many centuries was far more closely in touch with the powerful nations to the east than it was with Egypt. A list might be compiled of symbols and ceremonies that seem to have come either directly or indirectly from Babylonia. But such a compilation would be quite overshadowed by the fact that Kabbalism had its origin here, and that the sacred word itself, which was brought to the West by the Kabbalists, was based on what they learned here. It is claimed that the Babylonians invented the arch, but even this is trivial in comparison with the word. These, then, are the people who I suggest we should consider as builders, and they were a people who built in brick. Their architecture was dependent on the nature of the country. In the alluvial plain, no stone was procurable. Clay, on the other hand, was everywhere. All buildings, accordingly, were constructed of clay bricks baked in the sun and bonded together with cement of the same material. Their roofs were of wood, supported not infrequently by the stems of palm. The palm stems, in time, became pillars, and Babylonia was thus the birthplace of columnar architecture. The employment of brick had a very direct effect upon the character of Babylonian architecture. Thick walls supported by buttresses and devoid of sculpture were necessitated by it. The buildings of Babylonia were eternally plain and flat. Masses of brick were piled up in the form of towers, or else built into long lines of wall of unbroken monotony. Yet these stupendous masses of brickwork were impressive. Grace, beauty, and elegance might be lacking, but they were, as Lanyard testifies, most awe-inspiring. In later ages, it is true, the Assyrians, with vainglorious ostentation, were to adorn the exteriors of their massive buildings with sculptures and decorative titlework. But these earlier inhabitants of the Mesopotamian plain required nothing of the sort. The most modernistic architects could not be more sternly utilitarian or more severely functional than were these builders of the past. Their style, as one writer has said, was clean, straightforward, and free from pretense. It does not require the thousands of inscribed tablets that have been excavated and deciphered, records of sales, loans, leases, hire agreements, gifts, partnerships, guarantees, and business transactions of every kind to tell us that these people were shrewd, precise, and practical. Yet these same people, so intensely practical and so exceedingly matter-of-fact, seem always to have made a huge and imposing temple the most important building in their cities. Often it was more than a temple. It was a sacred quarter with numerous sanctuaries and other buildings. Inscriptions that have been deciphered let us see that the temple administration was most elaborate. Over 30 different kinds of priests are recorded. High priests, diviners, anointers, musicians, singers, libationists, oracles, sacrificers, teachers, scribes, and so on. Yet all this elaboration does not assure us of the importance of religion in their lives, as does the imposing massiveness of the great temples they built. A humble structure standing unobtrusively on the outskirts of the city would have served well enough as a temple had their religion meant little to them. But they were a serious-minded people, and it is pleasing to think that the germ that was someday to develop into Royal Arch had its origin among them. To one feature of their temple building, however, particular attention should be directed. Near to the temple, and within the sacred quarter, there was usually a temple stage tower, or ziggurat, the stories of which varied from 2 to 7 stages, one set upon the other, and each succeeding stage being somewhat smaller until the top was reached. Woolley believes that these towers were used in the annual fertility sacrifices, when a priest and priestess who for 1 year had been given royal rank were sacrificial victims. But if he is correct, it is clear that the ziggurat would have been used for these ceremonies only once in the year, and therefore we should note what Dr. Jastrow has to say about them. The tower represents a mountain in miniature, and is to be explained as an endeavour on the part of a people coming from a mountain home to reproduce in their new surroundings the belief which placed the seat of the gods on mountain tops. This should not surprise us, who sing in our church services, "I to the hills will lift mine eyes, from whence doth come mine aid." That, long ago, there were men who believed that the gods they worshipped dwelt on mountain tops, but we cannot help admiring the ingenious way in which they provided for their mountain-dwelling gods when they migrated from their own mountain lands down to the flat Mesopotamian plain. These gods, however, were not supposed to remain continually in the sanctuaries built for them, or on the tops of these stage towers. Up to the top, or rather down from the top, of each tower was a spiralling, inclined path. Down this path, the god of the ziggurat was supposed to come from time to time in order that he might move about among his worshippers who lived in the city below him. The idea of a god who could descend to be with his people was continually in the minds of these men. It was to this land that the Jews came as captives. In every city where they lived, there were these stage towers, and the exiles could not fail to be impressed with the idea they conveyed. And thus it was that when the prophets who came back from the land of captivity prophesied about the one who was to come, they spoke to a people to whom the idea of a god who would descend and dwell among them was in no way strange. The Royal Arch is the degree of a word, and the Word was God, we read. And the Word was made flesh, and dwelt among us, we also read. If men saw nothing hard in that, was it not because in times that even then were remote, other men had grasped the lesson that was taught, ere Cyrus the king had released them from their long captivity? Babylonian architecture, we are told, certainly had great significance, for it not only reflected the contemporary human life, but in addition, besides being the foundation of the development of future generations, it also represented the foundation of their beliefs. We are also told that the intellect of Babylon and Assyria exerted more than a passing influence on that of the Hebrews, not merely touching it, but entering deep into it, and leaving its own impress upon it. And of the Hebrews, we are told that they were a peculiar people, practical yet mystical, strongly of the world, yet finding their chief solace in those things which are not of the world. And because Royal Archmasonry, which owes so much to Hebrew thought, is a degree of things spiritual, having naught to offer to those who care not to realize their spiritual potentialities, but affording illumination and encouragement to the earnest seeker after the divine, we are able to trace our way back, step by step, to ages long past, and to the builders of Babylon.